Well, welcome to anyone that's joining us today, and welcome to the Why series. The concept for these sessions is really pretty simple. We take and tackle a high impact and common people challenge. We collaborate with a wonderful thought leader, and then we ask 5 questions that aim to dive deeper into the why. I think if you're designing and leading change, sort of understanding some of those underlying motivators really helps you solve the right problem the right way. We also know time's precious, so we're keeping it short and sweet, and we'll be wrapped up in 15 minutes today. The subject we're going to focus on is the F word, feedback. I think it's a type of conversation that every one of us can improve, and arguably it's one of the most cost-effective performance tools every one of us has in our toolkit. We're lucky to have a wonderful expert to share their insights today, so let me introduce Alana Bennett. Alana, welcome.
Thanks, Tim. Great to be here.
Very quickly, Alana runs Connected Experience, and over 20 years and in different organizations, Alana's developed her expertise in understanding how leadership, development and experience all come together and where the magic happens. And she firmly believes that businesses are most successful when individuals, leaders and organizations are all connected and aligned. After 5 questions that focus on the why, Alana's going to share some ideas and insights that move us on to the how. So do stay with us. Time will go quickly. Alana, let's jump in with the first question.
Love to. Let's do it.
Why do we often hesitate to ask for feedback, even when we know it can really help us?
Yeah, I think there's an element here of we perhaps don't want to hear it, right? I think there's a fear of hearing something negative about ourselves, which is uncomfortable. None of us like to let people down. And I think the thought of this being the case is sometimes enough to actually hold us back from asking. So rather than, potentially hearing something that will make us feel uncomfortable, but in the long run help us grow, we actually refrain from asking in the first place.
Yeah.
I do think also there's perhaps also a lack of confidence in our ability to kind of handle what we hear, right? And so depending on the way that perhaps maybe feedback has been delivered in the past, did someone give me feedback and then help me work through it? And so I actually went on to do something differently, or actually did they drop a bomb and just run, right? So if that's also been my experience, maybe I haven't kind of got the confidence of what do I do with it once I've got it?
Yeah.
I would also say that there's a concern that feedback actually, if we ask for it, makes us look incompetent, right? Yeah. And so depending on the culture of your team or the organization, if in your business, expertise is highly valued, then asking for feedback can kind of feel scary because we may be saying we don't know something and we don't want to look dumb, right, in front of our bosses or peers. I think also there's an element here of actually we just don't know how to do it. Yeah, there's a skill piece here. And what we do know is that the quality of feedback has a much higher chance of being effective if we ask for it in the right way. Yeah. So, the good old any feedback for me is such a big, broad question that it's hard to respond to, right? If you're kind of then the person that's then giving that feedback. But if we can be really deliberate about what do we want feedback on, we're going to probably increase our chance of actually getting great feedback as a result. The other last thing though, Tim, that I think is really important worth mentioning is really just an awareness piece around feedback and neurodivergent people, which is important to mention because there's this condition called rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD, and it shows up in particular for people with ADHD. Not all people with ADHD have it, but it is worth understanding it. So what RSD is that when you experience severe emotional pain because of this fear of failure or rejection. Okay. And so if this is present for someone, actually giving and asking for feedback can be a real physical experience for them, right? And even though that can be the case for others, it's even more heightened in neurodivergent people. So just really important that we have an awareness that some people have a sensitivity to feedback, that actually sometimes there's nothing that we can do to fix that, right? So just again, being aware of what might the conversation be with that individual to make sure that we set up the right conditions for that feedback in the first place.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Next question.
Yeah.
Why does giving feedbacks feel so tough or awkward? again,
Yeah.
when we know as a leader, it's essential to growth.
Yeah. I mean, look, let's assume here we're obviously talking about constructive feedback, right?
Okay.
Because I
Yeah.
think we all know positive feedback is pretty easy to do. Although what I will say is, and maybe this is a separate conversation another time, is positive feedback still needs to be delivered really well. Now, I wish I could stand here and say I've got good news, I've got the silver bullet. I don't. I think this sort of feedback is hard, right? And in some respect, it should be, because it means you care about it and you want to do a good job of it. It is important to remember, though, it is a skill, right? I think sometimes we just assume we can do it and do it well. The reality is that we do have to practice and build our confidence, so it feels less daunting. But there are a few things at play here when we think about this why. And I think first and foremost, it's uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable to give people, constructive feedback. And actually, sometimes what makes it uncomfortable is that we just don't even know how to start the conversation. We know, we've got something to tell someone, but, we don't know how to literally say those first words that kind of, get it out of our mouths. I think the other thing is we're actually worried about hurting someone's feeling or damaging the relationship, right? I think no one wants to work and have tension in a relationship. So, again, in our own mind, when we're doing this kind of seesaw of what's the lesser of two evils, sometimes, we go put up with a performance issue or impact the relationship. These two things can kind of weigh heavily in someone's mind when they've got to give this type of feedback. I would also say that depending on the experience of giving feedback, the person who has to give it sometimes may be reluctant depending on what it has led to in the past. So if they've delivered feedback and it's kind of been ill received and it's led to no change, sometimes that can be enough to stop them from doing it, because they kind of think, what's the point? I could potentially upset someone and nothing changes as a result, right? So that can kind of hold them back from giving that feedback. And, as I mentioned earlier, as well as the skill of starting, the skill of having the whole conversation, right? Just knowing how to actually phrase the words that I need to phrase. How do I, make sure that when I finish giving them that feedback, that person's actually walking out with something to do. I think all of those things talk to, why it feels tough when we've got to give that constructive feedback.
Yeah. And for me, I love that one, the skill of starting. I find that hard.
Yeah.
But once you're broken that shell, then it's okay. You're into it. But knowing how to start sounds silly, but it's a barrier.
Absolutely.
Okay, next question. We're going to keep moving.
Yep.
Why do our past experiences with feedback sort of shape how willing we are to dive into these conversations now?
Yeah. Look, our brains are spectacular organs, right? And when we experience something positive or negative, it creates these mental models and emotional associations. And so what happens is when that situation arises again, the way that I almost think about it, our brain has this little catalog, right? It's going and it's flicking back to, when did I last experience this and how did I feel? So instantly we've got this association, right? So if in the past someone has had a really positive experience, great, they'll probably will then be going, that mental model has kind of risen and said it was great. It's going to be a great conversation. If it's the flip of that, if that mental model comes back and it was awful and there's, real kind of negative emotions associated with it, then that obviously is going to really influence the willingness to participate, in that particular feedback conversation.
Yeah.
What I will say, though, is it can also have the effect of a lesson well learned, right? So often, if you are the recipient of negative feedback or feedback that's been poorly delivered, that sometimes for some people is a wonderful lesson in what not to do, right? So even though they might have a negative emotional association with that moment, they may also choose to do it very differently as a result of how they felt in that moment. So that's really important to remember as well, right? I think lastly on that, you cannot underestimate the impact of role models. So if I'm not seeing enough people around me give feedback well, then that can also sometimes get in the way, right, of me wanting to experiment and try and give feedback, because I'm not seeing other people do it.
Yeah.
And do it well, importantly.
And there must be, we won't dive into that today, but something that happens in life And it starts early too. If I say to my daughter, Mum and I want to speak to you about something, the default position, although I'd like to think it's not like that, it's like, what have I done wrong? That's the inbuilt reaction. So it's sort of it almost feels like any conversation is a threat, but there's stuff going on there which I'm sure builds. But
absolutely.
Okay, next one. Why do we shy away from giving constructive feedback to people we care about or work more closely with?
Yes. So look, I think the reality in this case is when we place a high value on a particular relationship, whether that's personally or professionally, naturally we want to avoid conflict or tension in that relationship, right? So that in itself is enough to stop us giving feedback. We just don't want to damage the trust that exists in that relationship. I think there's also this piece of like, will it be misinterpreted or taken personally, right? Will they think I'm attacking them as a person rather than trying to, give them that opportunity to grow? And I think for some people, particularly in workplace relationships where you've got close friendships, it can feel hard to separate that personal relationship with that feedback, right? So again, it feels kind of really tricky for people to give, feedback in those relationships, which again can all lead to people holding back from saying anything in the first place, right? They value the relationship more so than, giving them that feedback. It's tough.
Yeah, it is. And I find it I thought about that question. I thought I've got it too. I find some feedback is easier when there's a close bond, and some is harder. But the bond influences that. The nature of the relationships influences it a bit. So something to catch. His question. Why does the way feedback is shared change how we take it in and what we do with it?
Yeah. So look, this goes back to the way that our brains work, right? Is the way that we hear and process information leads us to kind of take action based on that. So if feedback is being delivered to us in a really critical or kind of harsh manner, it can make us instantly feel defensive, right? We get that kind of mechanism up, and we in those moments where we've probably stopped listening. And in fact, if anyone has been in a situation like that, sometimes you can see people's eyes glaze over, right? Like they're no longer listening to you in those moments. On the other hand, if we've got feedback that's been shared with lots of empathy and clarity, there's this real focus on growth, and, the feedback giver is really clear on their intent, we're way more likely to be receptive to hearing it. And importantly, way more likely actually motivated to take change as a result of that feedback. So, there's some things that are really important, the tone of your voice, we all know that. You gave a great example of when you talk to your daughter, right? We know that difference of when we're kind of telling someone off, we've got really firm tone versus, the tone that we're talking now. The timing of it, when's the right time to do it? How clear are we? Our own intention kind of going into the conversation. These all kind of talking to the way that it's shared will impact the recipient's person to kind of take it in and do something with it. Ultimately, if it comes from a place of, caring for that person, a desire to see someone grow versus an attack or a place of kind of self-interest, we know which one leads to a better outcome.
Yeah. And Alana, moving from those, and it doesn't cover all of it, but there's 5 just good questions, some great insights. Knowing all of these elements and influences, and there are a lot that feed into this one. What's your advice for HR leaders who want to move the needle on this?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. How do I give you a few? Okay, so let's start with one that I think is foundational, and that is upskill everyone on feedback, not just your leaders, right? This idea of raising the capability across your whole business. What's that saying? You raise the tide and all boats rise. I think it's that piece. If you start to get really clear across your whole organization around what great feedback looks like, everyone rises as a result of that. So that would be the first one. I think secondly, keep it simple. There are lots of great frameworks that exist and all that fancy stuff, but let's not forget everything that we've just talked about in these minutes before this. It's hard, right? It's emotionally charged event giving feedback. So in terms of then the how we do it, keep it super simple. Yeah. Don't make it complicated for people to use the tools to actually deliver feedback. Do the basics and do them well. I would also then say, like, culturally, be really deliberate about the feedback culture that you're trying to create, right? So make sure that everyone's really clear on why you're doing this. Don't make it about underperformance. Often we hear feedback and we think about underperformance. We want to talk about, we're creating a feedback culture because we want to continue to grow as an organization, as individuals, and, all that good stuff. And so how you no one person is perfect at giving feedback. And so we have to share stories and set expectations of doing it regularly, so we build that skill to be able to, create this kind of feedback culture that exists in organizations. Have I got time for one more?
Quick one.
Yes. Someone said to me recently, what if you stopped seeing that person as a problem? How might it change your approach? Yeah. And isn't that an interesting lens to consider how you might deliver feedback? So I'll leave you on that one, because I think it can look different for everyone, and it's a great lens to be thinking as a feedback giver. If I stop seeing that person as a problem, how might I approach it with curiosity about how I get feedback?
Alana, thank you. And interestingly, it's challenging. 15 minutes. It's a race by. Look, and it's a theme and a subject with lots of layers to it. The intent, as I said, is just a couple of those areas, triggering a little bit of that awareness for people. If feedback's something that you're trying to move the needle on out there, we just hope there's some insights and a couple of little nuggets today that help you think about your solution and approach. That's the aim of these sessions. For everyone that's registered or has attended, we will be sharing a short ebook that touches just not on what we've talked about today, but extends into the how, to hopefully give you some signposts and some momentums. So, Alana, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. Everyone else, thank you too. Keep your eyes out for the next Y session. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.